off. Matt Zwolinski is a professor of philosophy at the University of San Diego, where he's also the director of the Center for Ethics, Economics, and Public Policy, and director of their undergraduate and minor in philosophy, politics, and economics. His most recent book, as I mentioned, is The Individualists, Radicals, Reactionaries, and the Struggle for the Soul of Libertarianism, which came out this year. But he's also the co-author of Universal Basic Income, What Everyone Needs to Know, from Oxford University Press. Stephanie Slade is a senior editor at Reason Magazine, the magazine of free minds and free markets. She's a fellow in liberal studies at the Acton Institute and a media fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. Her writing has appeared in America, the New York Times, the U.S. News and World Report, the Online Library of Liberty, and many other places. She covers the intersection of religion and politics and is perhaps best known for her piece, Why I'm a Pro-Life Libertarian, in Reason Magazine. We're really happy to have both of these great guests with us here today. And we're going to start off with giving Stephanie 10 minutes to talk about what she thinks about the relationship between libertarians and conservatives.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to choose doggedly to treat this as not a debate. I'm very intimidated by the thought of debating against Matt Zwolinski, who's somebody I've been reading and following and admiring for many, many years. And so I choose to think of this as a conversation and not a debate. We'll see how Matt responds. So I think the answer to the question of sort of, are libertarians and conservatives allies, or should they be allies, or can they be allies? Are they naturally sort of on the same team, so to speak? Depends a lot on what you mean by, what kind of libertarian are you talking to, and what kind of conservative are you talking to? What do you mean by conservative? What kind of conservative? And Matt is now, I think, one of the leading experts on what the different kinds of libertarians are. His recent book, The Individualist, is all about that. I spend a lot of my time studying and thinking about and writing about the history of conservatism, especially in the US context, and the different kind of strains and strands and developments and currents that have happened in the American conservative movement. And so I'm going to focus on this question of what do we mean by conservative? And I think that the answer to the sort of debate question depends a lot on what kind of conservative you're imagining. In America, and it only honestly just occurred to me that the Canadian experience as a Commonwealth country may be somewhere in between the European experience and the US experience in a way that I don't have any insight into. So please forgive me for bringing a truly US-centric perspective to this. In America, the idea of conservatism has always meant something very different from what it would have meant in a European context. So in Europe, you think conservative, you think maybe throne and altar, you think a defense of old ways of being, such as monarchy or aristocracy. But in the US, that was not really part of the heritage that conservatives ever thought of themselves as defending. American conservatives think of themselves as wanting to conserve, preserve, defend the American founding, which of course was itself in many ways liberal. So America has this liberal founding, at least it's a strong liberal current in the liberal founding, and American conservatives want to defend that founding. And so in that sense, it will mean something different if we're talking about an American conservative versus a conservative in many other places. Conservatism, also, the word conservative really was not in use in the US much at all before the 20th century. And in the years after the sort of New Deal and then World War II, there was a pretty concerted or conscious effort to, among people who ended up being known as the conservative movement in America, to sort of develop a self-understanding. What are we for? What do we stand for? And part of this was they were definitely opposed to the New Deal. They were definitely opposed to the Soviet Union and communism abroad. But then beyond that, what are they for? And I think this is definitely a simplification, but it's fair to say that in the early days, there were two camps that were arguing, one that was more focused on a sort of libertarian economic perspective. So this is people like, Hayek and Friedman. And they said that this is an important part of what it means to be, that this movement should stand for in America. And then there was another camp that was more what you might think of as religiously traditionalist. And so this is people like Russell Kirk and Robert Nisbet and some of the Southern agrarians who wanted to maintain sort of older ways of life, who cared a lot more about Judeo-Christian values and family and faith and sort of, again, this more conservative, socially conservative things. And there was a tussle. There was an intellectual debate in the years after, in sort of the mid 20th century, the years after World War II, over which of these visions ought to be dominant or should determine the future of this movement that was emerging, this sort of nascent conservative movement. And they battled it out. They would go to Philadelphia Society meetings and they would give dueling speeches, or they would write dueling essays that would be published in National Review magazine and other journals. And there were these two sort of camps. I think it's fair to say that there were these two different camps. However, pretty soon thereafter, in the 1950s and 1960s, a third sort of answer came about. It was most closely associated with this guy named Frank Meyer. The book that I recommended for the book draw is his book. Frank Meyer was a senior editor at National Review magazine. And what he argued was, hey, we don't have to choose. In fact, it's not liberty or virtue. It's not libertarianism or sort of social conservatism. It's both. That liberty and virtue are the two pillars upon which Western civilization rests. And if you care about one, you need to care about the other, because if one of those pillars falls, the whole project will collapse. So you want a free society, you're a libertarian, you care about individual liberty, you want a free society, you need to also care about a virtuous culture. Or you're a religious traditionalist, you care about tradition and community and family and transcendent truth and all of that stuff. The only way to have a truly virtuous society is to have political freedom, for people to pursue that virtue, freely. It can't be coerced. So this argument, it was a synthesis that Frank Meyer was offering, not just a coalition of libertarians and conservatives coming together and sort of coming together as allies, but rather it was this philosophical synthesis that said liberty needs virtue, virtue needs liberty. They're mutually reinforcing. They're both necessary. We must defend them both. And this idea that, again, came to be known as fusionism, it actually wasn't coined by Frank Meyer. He really hated the term fusionism, but it stuck anyway. So that was what people called it, this idea that liberty and virtue are fused. Libertarianism and conservatism in a certain sense need each other, and we need to defend them both. This came to be known as fusionism, and it was immensely influential. It became basically the philosophical foundation upon which all the major conservative institutions in America in the second half of the 20th century were built. So you go through and you look at the mission statements of ISI or the Heritage Foundation or TFAS or all these different groups that were founded, advocacy organizations, think tanks, all these different conservative student groups, and you look at their mission statements and they all talk about these two things of liberty and virtue. And they say it, personal responsibility and individual freedom, free markets and, transcendent truth. There's different ways, different language used, but the idea that these two things go together and we need them both was just like woven into the foundation of the conservative movement in the US in the second half of the 20th century. And so the thing I want to leave you with most is that fusionism was not about an alliance. It's actually ahistorical to think of fusionism as just a mere alliance or coalition of different groups. That happened certainly during the Cold War years. There were coalitions that were built, but it was more than that. It was a philosophical synthesis, and it was one that a lot of people bought into. That, I mean, initially you had these different camps, but eventually they sort of became, and there were always dissenters. There were always some libertarians who were like, no, I reject this fusionist synthesis. And there were some religious traditionalists, conservative social conservatives who said, absolutely not, we don't want anything to do with this. But a lot of people, the consensus became a fusionist one on the right of center in America. Frank Meyer offered an additional, I think, really important piece of his framework that has been very influential for me, and is a thing that I'm trying to resuscitate in our politics, which is he said, okay, liberty and virtue both are important. How do we have two number one priorities? How do we deal with the tension that seems to create? And he said, basically, it's simple. Think in terms of two separate spheres, a governmental sphere and a non-governmental sphere. And in the governmental sphere, when it comes to using the law, this state coercion, public policy questions, in that political governmental sphere, liberty ought to be the highest value. That should be the preeminent value. So liberty, individual liberty, is the highest political value, he said. However, in the non-governmental sphere, in all the aspects of life that don't involve state coercion, he said, ultimately, the point of having that liberty in the first place is to pursue virtue, is to live virtuous lives, is to build a virtuous society. And so you have the highest value in the non-governmental sphere is not liberty. We aren't just free for the sake of being free. We're free for the sake of using that freedom to pursue the higher things, he would say. So virtue is the higher value in the non-governmental, non-political sphere. And that framework of thinking, sort of keeping the two spheres at least sort of mentally separated, and therefore helping to know, okay, if we're talking about public policy, we want to be privileging liberty, but if we're not talking about state coercion, we ought to be thinking about the higher things that are higher than liberty. That has been very, I think, It was very influential and successful in terms of forging a consensus in the conservative movement in the U.S. I think is a thing that has been lost in recent years. So we have had this fracturing where many conservatives want to use the state power to impose their understanding of virtue on society. That's a repudiation of fusionism, right? It's basically saying we don't need the liberty pillar. We just want the virtue pillar. We don't need your liberty anymore. Some of them are very explicit. You libertarians can take a hike. We don't want you anymore. And there's many libertarians who have just don't ever even ask themselves the question of liberty for what, freedom for what is a good life, what is virtue, what are our moral obligations to each other, and is there anything that we owe to the sort of Judeo-Christian inheritance of this understanding of virtue. So both camps, I think, are not doing a very good job of being good fusionists, but I want to try to fix that. That's what my work is trying to do, is to try to revive the idea of fusionism as this synthesis. And to the extent that we are talking about fusionist libertarians and fusionist conservatives, I think that it's obvious that there's lots of room. They're obvious allies, right? They should be friends. The answer to the question is yes. To the extent that we're talking about people who reject that idea of fusionism, then there's actually still, I think, a lot of room to work together, but it's going to be a little bit harder to make those negotiations.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Stephanie. No pressure, Matt. That was exactly 10 minutes.
God. I'm gonna fail already.
I got to throw in a very brief editorial just for Stephanie's sake. As you mentioned, how different the Canadian experience might be from the American. Certainly my impression is that although Canada is almost always somewhere between Canada and the Europe, in this case, as in many others, we're much closer to the US, I think. And certainly we look to the US. We all know what's going on in your politics. And so I think it's pretty good to consider them as being pretty equivalent. If anyone thinks I'm wrong, you can put your own opinion in the chat or save that for the Q&A. We'll now turn to Matt for his 10 minutes.
All right, 10 or so minutes. So I want to thank you, Matt, for thinking of this debate, for inviting me, for inviting Stephanie, and giving me the opportunity to talk with her. Because in conversation, not in debate, I'm very much on board with the spirit of that. I think this is a fantastic topic, one I thought a bit about, not nearly as much as Stephanie, but certainly something that I think is important, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk with somebody who's given so much thought to this and has, I think, such a really helpful perspective on a lot of these issues. And her comments were especially helpful to me in that they cleared a lot of ground that I thought needed clearing, and I was going to have to clear myself. And so she's saved me a bit of trouble there. Right. So she's introduced this idea of fusionism and the source of that idea in Frank Meyer's work on In Defense of Freedom. And I want to talk a bit about that project particularly, but I also want to talk about the more general project, not like Stephanie, not of the sort of opportunities for political alliances between conservatives and libertarians, because A, that's outside of my expertise, and B, I think that's just outside of the scope of this conversation. It's a very different question, what kinds of political strategies might be useful in achieving this or that policy goal, from the philosophical question of where are the areas of overlap and tension between conservatism and libertarianism as intellectual systems. So let me start first with the narrower issue of kind of Meyerian fusionism, which is this rather specific idea that freedom and virtue are compatible and I think sort of codependent in a sense, right? So as I understand Meyer's thesis, it consists of two kind of related hypotheses, one of which is that freedom requires virtue, the other of which is that virtue requires freedom. And I think the first of those theses I'm essentially fully on board with. So freedom, a free society, must be in some sense a virtuous society. I think that liberal institutions like markets and a divided government with the separation of powers, these are institutions that are in some sense designed to operate on an economy of virtue, right? So they're designed to work well, even if people are behaving selfishly, or even if people are behaving factionally in government. But even so, I think at the end of the day, institutions are only good as the people who constitute those institutions. institutions are in a sense built of people, right? The paper rules of a constitution aren't meaningful in any sense by themselves. They're not self-enforcing, they're not self-interpreting. So at a minimum, I think liberal institutions presuppose a certain level of social trust. I think they also presuppose a certain level of social trustworthiness, right? They presuppose that people are going to behave with certain attitudes, certain dispositions towards acting. In other words, virtues in the classical sense. So on that part of the thesis, that a free society requires a certain measure of virtue on the part of its citizens, I'm fully on board. The more problematic aspect of the thesis, I think, is that virtue requires freedom, or rather that virtue sort of always requires freedom. Meyer's argument is that, to oversimplify a little bit, that it's not really a virtuous act if you don't choose it freely, right? So, clearly, if somebody just physically forces your body to move in a certain kind of way, right? So like grab your hand with a sandwich in it and they hold it out to a homeless person, right? And sort of force you to give the sandwich to the other person. You haven't really done anything. You haven't even performed an action, as it were. Your body has just been moved by this external force. So it's not a virtuous act, in part because it's not an act at all. But even if we grant, I think, that virtuous action requires freedom, even if we can't, in other words, compel virtue itself, I think we can nevertheless, it's possible to use compulsion to establish conditions under which the development of virtue is either more or less likely, right? So think of this as kind of the conservative analog to, the behavioral economics, the idea of nudging people, right? We can use the powers of the state to make pornography harder to get if you think access to pornography is incompatible with virtue, or make alcohol harder to get, or make exposure to ennobling and enlightening experiences easier to get. So I don't think it follows from the fact that virtuous action must be freely chosen that there's no room for state coercion at all. And in fact, this is a point that was made in that first fusionist debate, I think very trenchantly, by Brent Bozell, whose views and certainly his later development I find quite troubling in a number of respects. But I think he was just right in his critique of Meyer here. 1962 essay, Freedom or Virtue, which I think is really a well-done criticism of the fusionist project as expressed in Meyer. Okay, so stepping now away from that narrow fusionist project to the broader question of what kind of overlaps or tensions are there between libertarianism and conservatism. Like Stephanie says, right, I'll start in the same kind of academic way that she started. It depends on what you mean by these ideas, right? And both libertarianism and conservatism are ideas or words that have been used to refer to a lot of, in some ways, very distinct ideas. One distinction that John Tomasi and I draw in The Individualist is a distinction between what we call strict libertarianism and classical liberalism. So strict libertarianism is a phrase we use to refer to this kind of radical political position committed to the idea that force may only be used non-aggressively in the defense of person and property. This is the kind of libertarianism that you find in people like Murray Rothbard, in Ayn Rand, I think, in Robert Nozick. And that is a view which, if applied consistently, would require a quite radical restructuring of many existing political and economic institutions. At the minimum, it would require a reduction of the state to the level of a night watchman. Perhaps it would require its abolition altogether. It would perhaps require sweeping rectifications in the redistribution of wealth and property in order to correct for past injustices. The issue of historical injustice is a hard one for libertarians, right? But usually when libertarians talk about historical justice, they're talking about things like slavery or, the conquest of the Americas from the Native Americans. But of course, there's a lot of injustices that the state has perpetuated in our own lifetime. And if you're committed to the kind of historical version of libertarianism that you find in people like Nozick and Rothbard, then we got to do something about that. So a very radical view. And I think this kind of libertarianism is just not compatible with conservatism. It's not compatible with even kind of broadly evolutionary Hayekian classical liberalism, as is apparent, I think, from the disdain that strict libertarians like Murray Rothbard heaped upon people like Hayek. Frank Meyer himself rejected this kind of view in 1969. He called it libertinism rather than libertarianism. He said that libertines are ideologues who wish to, and this is a quote, he says, they reject reality as it has been studied, grasped, understood, and acted upon in 5,000 years or so of civilized history, and pose an abstract construction as the basis of actions. They want to impose their own design on society, simple, neat, and inhuman as the blueprints of a bulldozing engineer. So Meyer seems to kind of lump these strict libertarians in the same category as, the Jacobins, essentially, as a group of individuals who want to burn society down and build it up again from scratch on the basis of commitment to an abstract philosophical ideal. So that, I think, is unpromising soil on which to build a libertarian-conservative alliance. There is, however, another strand of libertarianism that I think has more promise to it for the Fusionist project, which we call in the book classical liberalism. Other people use different names for it, but the idea here is that as opposed to strict libertarians who embrace a kind of rationalist, monist, and absolutist project, classical liberals tend to be pluralist, more empiricist, and non-absolutist. They tend to accept the existence of multiple moral and political values, which sometimes come into conflict and stand in need of a trade-off. Their policy prescriptions that they make are at least partly a function of empirically falsifiable claims that open to revision in the light of new empirical evidence. They're committed to liberty, they're committed to property, but they're committed to these things as a strong but defeasible presumption, not a kind of moral, rationalistic absolute, as are the strict libertarians. Okay, so that's the libertarian side of things. What about conservatism? What are the different kinds of conservatism that might be compatible with that version of libertarianism? Well, conservatism is, libertarianism is hard to define, but conservatism, I think, is even harder to define. It's notoriously hard to define in political philosophy. But I think if we look at a few ideas and principles that conservatives have endorsed, and by focusing on ones where I think, the tension between libertarianism and conservatism comes out, just for the sake of time, I'm not going to focus on the areas of overlap, but that'll give us a clearer picture of where things stand. So what do conservatives stand for? One principle that a lot of conservatives stand for is this idea of the importance of tradition. Russell Kirk has, these 10 conservative principles, one of which is custom, convention, and kind of continuity. Another is the principle of prescription. But the basic idea here is that we should give heavy deference to tradition and to established institutions, and that we should be distrustful of sweeping reforms, especially those driven by a commitment to an abstract principle. That's an idea, I think, that's congenial to a lot of libertarians, including to Stephanie, I think, to me, I think, and of course to Hayek, right? This is kind of an idea that's central to Hayek's own thought, this emphasis on evolved social institutions, evolved moral rules. But of course, Hayek himself famously rejected the label of conservative for his view, which suggests that this kind of deference, at least on his view, isn't sufficient to make one of a conservative. And one of the most trenchant points that Hayek makes in that famous essay, Why I'm Not a Conservative, is that for conservatives, although they profess an admiration for evolved social and moral institutions, that admiration of conservatives, Hayek said, seems to apply only to the past and not to the future, right? In other words, conservatives don't have a vision of how the present situation might evolve, might continue to evolve in ways that wind up looking quite different from how they look today. Right? Institutional growth presupposes a process of change. And while in principle, the conservative isn't opposed to change as such, but only to radical and sweeping change, I worry that in practice, right, whether we're talking about the abolition of slavery, the struggle for women's rights, racial integration, gay marriage, conservatives seem to very often conclude that changes, whether gradual or sweeping, that result in an expansion of rights and privileges from the powerful to the subordinate are a dire threat to the fabric of social order and cannot be abided by. So that's a real problem, I think, with this conservative deference for tradition and a source of at least potential tension between the conservative and the liberal, as Hayek called himself, or the libertarians. Quickly, another couple principles. I know I'm already pushing the bounds of Matt's patience here, but conservatives, I think there's also a heavy emphasis among conservatives on the idea of religion, right, and the role of government in promoting religion, or at least not trampling upon religion. I think fusionists tend to minimize in some ways the conservative emphasis on religion. Sometimes fusionists will view this emphasis as just kind of proxy for the conservative belief in a transcendent moral order, right? So what's really important is not that you be a Catholic or whatever, it's that you believe in some kind of transcendent moral order. But again, when you listen to what conservatives actually say and how they act in practice, it looks like it's a lot more than that, right? So if you look at Yoram Hazony, for instance, whose recent 2022 book, Conservatism: A Rediscovery, what he has to say about religion, one quote from that book is that the state is, on the conservative view, meant to uphold and honor God and the Bible, the congregation and the family, and the religious practices common to the nation. So this isn't merely some belief in transcendent order. It's not even merely a belief in religion in the abstract, right? It's a belief in the imperative of the state supporting and maintaining some particular religion. And of course, that view is even more fully developed in the phenomenon of Catholic integralism, which we see today, which is, I think, quite anathema to libertarian ideas of individual autonomy, freedom of choice, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, and so forth. Conservatives are very often nationalists. Again, Hazony embraces this explicitly as one of his principles. This is an idea that's central, of course, to the new national conservatism, but it's not a new idea by any means. This is not an innovation in conservative thought that has occurred in the last decade or so. Back in 1960, in that essay by Hayek, he calls out conservatisms for their nationalism, arguing that this is a bridge from conservatism to a kind of collectivism, right, where we are always thinking in terms of our industry or our resources as a collective entity, as a nation. This, I think, again, is a source of both theoretical conflict between conservatives and libertarians, and policy conflict on issues like immigration, on militarism, on trade policy, and so forth. Finally, last thing, and maybe the most troubling aspect of conservatism from the perspective of a libertarian, is its tendency to embrace principles of authority, of hierarchy, and of coercion, whether it's drug legalization or the suppression of pornography or the criminalization of homosexual behavior. As Hayek said, it seems as though the conservative does not object to coercion or arbitrary power on principle, so long as it's used for what he regards as the right purposes. This is, I think, and has been especially troubling on issues of racial and sexual freedom. So going back to Meyer, right? I mean, I think it's important to remember that Meyer's fusionist project was launched within the pages of a journal that was on record as defending racial segregation in the South, right? Buckley's sort of infamous 1957 editorial on why the South might prevail. Meyer himself never lent his voice to that particular crusade, but he never lent it against it either. In fact, he was deliberately equivocal. He argued that segregation laws and integrating laws are both equally wrong. So it's kind of like, one side on the other side. Now, of course, like what follows from that, I mean, obviously, I'm not making the argument that, Meyer was a racist or conservatives as such are racist. That's not the point. The point is that if you've got a racist society, right, or a sexist society or a homophobic society or whatever, the conservative emphasis on defending traditional systems of hierarchy and subordination kind of naturally lends itself to a racist interpretation among that society. And that affinity makes conservatism considerably more appealing to those who might be seeking an ideology to defend and justify their pre-existing racist or sexist goals. Now, to be fair, I don't think libertarians have always stood up as well as they could have or should have for those rights either. But what libertarianism does have going for it, I think, is a theory, is a view that does commit them to placing a primacy on the dignity and the freedom of the individual. And what that means is, like the American founding documents, when they fail to live up to that standard, right, they are vulnerable to the charge of intellectual inconsistency. So while libertarians don't always live up to their ideal, they at least have an ideal that points them in the right direction for future improvement. And that, I think, is something that conservatism, by its very nature, is largely incapable of doing.
Thanks, Matt. I feel the need to gently chide Matt to say that we have left the virtuous society that Stephanie started us out on the road on, being very timely, and now who will blame her if she speaks a little bit more than the time? But I should also
Certainly not I.
I should also tell the audience, I said to Matt in our conversation prior that we are much more interested in having an interesting conversation today than abiding by the rules imposed by the Oxford Debating Society or anyone else. So I did tell him it was okay if he went a little bit over. We will now go over to Stephanie, who will have about 5 minutes to respond to Matt.
Sorry. Okay. Now can you hear me? Okay. I definitely agree with a lot of what Matt said. Meyer, for example, was, he was not a supporter of the sort of very rationalistic liberalism or libertarianism. His understanding of what he was arguing for when he argued for liberty was not that sort of radical, rationalist kind of thing. It was much more Hayekian. He argued that actually that the American heritage was one of two streams of sort of from history, that we were inheritors of these two streams, one being a sort of the Judeo-Christian stream, which is the one that I'm associating with virtue, and one that was the liberal, classically liberal stream, that liberty, that I'm calling liberty, and that this was our inheritance as Americans, and so it was very experiential for him. He felt like we inherited this as a gift, we have an obligation to therefore defend it. But what you'll notice if you sort of follow through his thinking about this fusionist framework, where you have the governmental and non-governmental spheres, and in the governmental sphere, liberty is the highest value. Government basically, he would have said government exists to protect life, liberty, and property, essentially, and get out of the way. And then we, in the non-governmental sphere, our job is to use that freedom that government has, that space that government has carved out in order to pursue virtue. Understand virtue and build a virtuous society and live a good life and all of that. With that, if you really follow that to sort of strictly, you end up with something that is, I would say, indistinguishable from a libertarian political agenda. At least as we understand libertarianism today, certainly. Like if you're truly following, buying into Meyerian fusionism, and you think that the point of government is to privilege individual, to protect individual rights and liberties, keep us safe and secure, have maybe the government should lock up criminals, but it should not be trying to make us virtuous citizens in any way. That's not its job. That would be an improper use of state coercion. You end up with policies that would, I think, that almost any libertarian would consider to be certainly an improvement on where we are today. So you end up with something that is, even if you're a fusionist conservative, you end up with a support for public policy that is libertarian. In the non-governmental sphere, then you have a remaining debate that can be had over, okay, well, what do we do with that freedom? What does a good life look like? What are our obligations to each other? What is virtue? Should we care about virtue at all? And what does it mean if we should? And all of that. And the fusionists, by definition, under Frank Meyer's definition, and the one that I'm trying to revive, would say, well, yeah, virtue means something very particular, and it requires, at the very least, a sort of respect for transcendent truth and objective morality and all of that, and probably even something more closer to, respect for the Judeo-Christian teachings. So we want to say, like, we're not just saying virtue. Virtue could mean anything. You could use that word and attach it to any meaning. Like, they mean something very particular. They mean what we would call a conservative definition of virtue. And so in that space, if you're a fusionist, you accept a particular definition of virtue, of the sort of highest value in the non-governmental sphere. And a libertarian might agree with you on public policy, but disagree with you on how to live your life and what you should use your freedom for, right? There could be disagreement still there, but we've gotten a lot of the way. I feel like we've actually still accomplished something pretty impressive by developing that, by agreeing to that common ground of, okay, well, at least we're not going to use state power to try to make you virtuous. You might disagree with me about what virtue is or what a good life is or whatever. We might have different goals for the culture. But in some cases, the conservative might have goals that that Matt finds appalling or that I find appalling. But at least we've said you don't get to use state coercion. We've really, I think, radically reduced the mischief that can be done if all. I'm not saying it's gone away entirely, but if all you can do is use social pressure, right, market pressure and persuasion and that sort of thing, cultural institution building and all of that, but you can't use actual coercion to impose your views, you could still have a society that's unfree in many ways. You could have a really overbearingly patriarchal society where there's no laws on the books, but just women aren't given the same opportunities as men, for example. That's problematic, but I think it's pretty clearly less problematic than a world in which you can actually have the laws on the books. So fusionism gets us at least closer to, I think, where we want to be, and it creates more opportunities for living peacefully together, and again carves out that space where we can still disagree about what kind of society we want to use our freedom to build, or what kind of lives we think we ought to be living once we have that freedom. But there's just less room for mischief if nobody is allowed to use actual like violence or the threat of violence against each other. And that is important. I mean, the things that you hear from people like Yoram Hazony, the Christian nationalists, some of the national conservatives, and certainly the Catholic integralists that Matt mentioned, what they're saying that is so troubling, and that makes what they're arguing for such an incredible break from conservatism as it was understood in the 20th century in America, is that they're not willing to abide by the fusionist framework. They want to use state coercion to impose their understanding of virtue on everyone else. They're not willing to say, no, liberty is the highest political value. They say, no, liberty is not the highest political value. Virtue is the highest value in all domains. And we will use state power. In fact, we embrace a muscular use of state power in order to promote the common good as we understand it, to make people virtuous, even if they don't agree with us about what that means. When if they want to return, use the public power to do these things, they're rejecting fusionism, actually. And that it's currently a very energetic movement. I call this the illiberal right, and there's a bunch of different people and factions that are pushing this sort of way of thinking, this way of understanding conservatism. And they would say things like, your conservatism, your fusionist conservatism of the 20th century failed, and so we reject it. We want something else. We want conservatism to be something different from what it used to be, or how it used to be understood. So this is a real break from how it was, which I point out only to say that I don't think that conservatism needs to be defined or understood in these terms of wanting to use state power in these ways, or of authoritarianism and hierarchy, or even of privileging tradition, again, coercively privileging tradition. Because in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, we had a conservative movement in America that was very comfortable with separation of church and state, of keeping the state out of a lot of these questions. And the conservatives, of course, were of the two sort of parties in America, the two rough coalitions in America, they were the ones that were far more comfortable with the sort of dynamism and creative destruction of free markets and free trade. So in theory, conservatism, the dispositional conservatism, is one that is really resistant to change and is more comfortable with hierarchy and authoritarian top-down kind of decision making. In theory, that may be true, but in the American experience for the last 50 or 60 years until very recently, that was not what the conservative movement looked like. And fusionism is the thing that allowed them to sort of bypass that temptation.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. Come back to Matt for a response, and then open the floor for questions.
All right, I'll actually keep my response fairly short to make up for the historical injustice of me speaking too long last time. So this is great. This is a great conversation, and I think one thing I want to emphasize here is the degree in overlap between where Stephanie and I are coming from on this, right? Like, I think so. Both Stephanie and I are libertarians who think that virtue is really important. I think we're both Catholic. I think I heard you mention that in another podcast you did. I know I do. I think we both live kind of pretty bourgeois lifestyles, right? So the point I'm trying to make isn't that like virtue is unimportant. Rather, it's not by any means, right? The point I'm trying to make, rather, is essentially Bozel's, right? Which is that freedom and virtue are two different things, and only one of them can be your highest end, because they're kind of come into conflict, and when they come into conflict, you have to choose which is king. Now, how do you get around that problem as a fusionist? One approach you could take, and this is the approach that Stephanie has articulated, is borrowing from Meyer, is to say that, well, there are two spheres, right? There's the political sphere, and there's the personal sphere. And in the political sphere, liberty is king, and in the personal sphere, virtue is king. And I think that approach has some appeal to it, some merit to it. But of course, like, they aren't separate spheres, right? They're not completely separate spheres. They might not even be largely separate spheres. The political sphere shapes and defines the personal sphere, and in much in the same way, I think that the personal sphere in some ways defines and shapes the political one. So if you commit to the view that we're going to have maximum liberty, right? The goal is to maximize liberty in the political sphere. That entails, I think, that you're going to have less than maximum virtue in the personal sphere. By contrast, if you decide that what you want to maximize is virtue in the private sphere, then that means that you're going to have less than maximum liberty in the political sphere. Now, if you go for maximum liberty in the political sphere, cool, I'm happy with that. But then you're just a libertarian, right? You think virtue is important, but virtue isn't your highest, your end, right? I think, and look, to speak less abstractly, right? If we're talking about education policy, if we're talking about access to pornography, if we're talking about the criminalization or regulation of prostitution, if we're talking about abortion, it's just not at all clear to me how we're going to draw a clear dividing line between the political sphere and the personal sphere on those issues, such that we say that we're going to have maximum liberty, politically speaking, but encourage people to be virtuous in their personal lives. I think that's not an approach that is going to be satisfactory to either the conservative or the libertarian, depending on which way you go, right? If you maximize liberty on those things, that's going to leave most conservatives very, very unhappy. If you try to maximize virtue instead, you're going to wind up running afoul of a lot of liberties that libertarians are deeply committed to.
Wonderful. Great. Thanks very much to both of you. We will now throw the floor open to questions. Reminder, we have two ways that people can ask questions. You can use the reaction button you'll find at the bottom of your screen to raise your virtual hand, and I will call on you and ask the question yourself that way. If you're unable to use your camera and microphone, I invite you to put your question into the chat box, and I will sort of dip back and forth. But we're going to start off on our video queue with Paul Barnes.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. It's very interesting. A lot of things went through my mind because I have a particular interest in American religion. So I think that with the libertarian side, that they do underestimate and they completely misunderstand the religious movements in America and the differences and distinctions. Like, there's a huge difference between white evangelicals, American Catholics, Black Protestant churches, Jewish churches. Actually, I shouldn't say Jewish churches. That's whatever. But there's a huge difference, whatever. But one of the things that I think that is missing in this particular discussion is the group's relationships to both capitalism and technology. And I think that technology is a driver of a lot of our the breaking of our traditions. And I'm wondering if you guys could maybe comment on that.
Sure, I'm happy to. Stephanie, do you want to go, or I'm not really talking, so I guess I'll talk. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a nice point to raise. So I finished reading Patrick Deneen's first book last month. This is the Why Liberalism Failed. I haven't yet gotten around to his regime change book yet, but one of the striking things about that book, to somebody who's not super familiar with contemporary developments in conservative thought, is the degree to which Deneen is critical of both capitalism and technology. Technology in particular, I think, is surprising to a lot of people, and the degree to which Deneen allies himself, in fact, with environmentalists who have been critical of the role, the disruptive role that technology has played in American culture in particular, but of course, there's nothing distinctively American about this. I was, I guess, surprised to see that, but it does, I think, makes sense given the kinds of theoretical commitments that Deneen has underlying his view, and I think given the underlying commitments of conservatism as such. Another book I recently read, older book, Virginia Postrell's The Future and Its Enemies, which is maybe like 25 years old now. But in that view, she draws this distinction between stasists, not statists, but stasists, people who like stasis or the absence of change, and dynamists. And she argues that this is a distinction that kind of cuts across conservative liberal lines. But there's always been certainly this stasist element in conservatism that resists change. During much of the 20th century, it's true, conservatives were on the side of economic freedom, and so kind of allied themselves with, you know, Schumpeterian ideas of creative destruction and free markets. But you know, one interpretation of that is, and it's an interpretation that I'm sympathetic to, is that that was a kind of intellectually inconsistent stage in conservatives' thought and development, and that the Deneen type view, as much as I dislike it, is actually a more intellectually consistent version of conservatism than the kind of market-friendly fusionists that preceded it.
Yeah, I would just quickly say that I think that's right. Again, if you're starting with your definition of conservatism from the abstract as a person who doesn't, resists change and is uncomfortable with change and is more comfortable with hierarchy and all those things, then yeah, the conservatives of the American, of the last century who were not particularly characterized by those traits would seem intellectually inconsistent. But if instead you realize that the word conservative in the American context has always referred to something different, again, wanting to conserve and defend the things associated with the American founding, and in some way, in some ways to defend the liberal order, then I think it makes more sense.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Coming on to Will Ruger now for a question.
Hey guys, great conversation so far. I did miss a few of the first minutes, so apologies. But my question is around how would the two different types of folks who are talking here, right? The non-anarcho-capitalist libertarians, and then the kind of more conservative-friendly fusionists, shall we say, deal with how institutions that are considered the proper role of government, what role should virtue play in those, right? So in the sense of, for example, if you believe public schools should exist or the United States should have a national military, what role should virtue play in how we think about public administration of these? Because that seems to be a challenge and a tension. Like, so for example, should libertarians or should they be apoplectic about what happened in Loudoun, where parents were trying to help conservatize the curriculum, if you will, or the library? Or should they be okay with that? Because if you're going to have these types of institutions, then some thickness in terms of the kind of culture of these institutions is a valid concern for public debate.
So I definitely reject and think we ought to reject a sort of highly rationalistic liberalism that says that something like what I associate with France and in the French understanding of secularism is imposed coercively upon society in certain ways. You must keep your religion and your values out of the public square. That is not the American understanding of it. It's not one that I would defend. We have maybe it's a subtle distinction, but we believe in separation of church and state, but we do not believe in the separation of religion and politics, where the people who make up the polity of our country are not allowed to, are somehow supposed to like dissect their themselves and their personality and leave any values that might have a religious basis at home when they go to the polls or when they show up at work, if they work for the government or if they work, if they're a member of Congress or if they're a member an employee of the federal bureaucracy or whatever. That is not the way that we approach this. So understanding that we don't enact one set of values that are contended within society, like the Protestant understanding of virtue as opposed to the Catholic or Muslim or Jewish or some other understanding of virtue through law is not the same thing as saying that like the people that make up our society and that are inherently in many ways political actors are not allowed to bring their values with them when they show up to do their jobs and live their lives even in the public square. I think it's very important. That's not a comprehensive answer to Will's question, but given the number of people with their hands up, I will stop there.
So briefly, so first of all, Will, I'm glad you could make it. Good to see you here. And second of all, that's a really good question, by which I mean it's a question that I don't know how to answer. I think it's a hard problem, right? So we're faced with, I think, a tension between two legitimate values here, right? One of which is we might call a sort of the value of truth, right? So if there is a correct view about human virtue, about human nature, right, about the right way of structuring institutions so as to foster or protect human virtue, then right, the perspective of truth leads us to want to implement that view in whatever activities are the legitimate function of state, whether it's education policy or foreign policy or what have you. On the other side of the tension is this I guess a value that this maybe isn't the best word for it, but maybe the value of representation or the value of neutrality, right? That the value of pluralism, that the recognition that we live in a diverse society where people have a range of reasonable but incompatible views about questions of virtue and character, and that there's therefore something illegitimate about governments imposing or enforcing or using coercion, right, to maintain one particular view among others. That I think is just, there's a real tension there, and I'm not totally sure how to resolve it. I will say that I have a lot of respect and admiration for the kind of approach that people like Kevin Vallier have taken with his kind of public reason approach to thinking about these issues. Kevin's, of course, somebody who has very deep religious commitments himself, but has a very well thought out, principled view about when it is and when it is not appropriate for the state to act on the basis of those kinds of considerations. So I'd recommend his work because he's a smart person who's thought about this much more than me.
Wonderful. Thanks, Matt. I will put on a quick plug there for Kevin Vallier's recent interview on our podcast, The Curious Task. So a couple times integralism has been mentioned, and of course, Matt is now shouting out Kevin Vallier stuff. So he has a recent interview with us on new religious threats to liberalism that I really enjoyed. And again, our podcast is The Curious Task, and you can find that on Google or any podcast platform that you have. Come now to Otto Leto with a question.
Thanks so much. I hope you can hear me. Thanks again for Stephanie, Matt, and Matt for organizing this. So I have one quick comment and a question. The comment is that, I've been doing a lot of work on Hume, and, Hume is interesting here to think about the relationship between freedom and virtue, because, as he reminds us, we can also think about freedom or the structure of freedom or the respect for the freedom of others, the property of others, as being itself a virtue, a very important one, and therefore the structure of freedom, could be seen as part of the structure of virtues, and therefore the link is quite complicated to think about how those two can be reconciled or put together. But my question is regarding the generalizability of the lessons, in a way, from this fusionist discourse, the history of conservative libertarian fusionism. It seems that the tendency can be to overcorrect in some other direction, to say, well, the problem was not so much that we made substantive commitments to virtue, but of conservative kind, but that we that the problem is that we made the wrong kind of substantive commitments, rather than that we made substantive commitments as part of the libertarian creed. And so, as someone who's very sympathetic to some of the sort of lessons of social justice and feminism and anti-racism and distributive justice concerns, I struggle, and I wonder if Matt, who's also been involved in developing these new types of somewhat thicker forms of libertarianism, worries about or is self-conscious about the danger of kind of new types of fusionism in other directions, the tendency being to sort of perhaps overcorrect away from the liberal neutrality standpoint. I worry about that myself. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, briefly. I mean, again, there's always this distinction that's between sort of two kinds of fusionism, right? The kind of theoretical project of looking for, points of overlap or continuity or codependence, and the political project of, working to build alliances and partner in pursuit of various policy objectives. I think there's always room for that latter kind of fusionism, whether it's left fusionism or right fusionism. I think, you don't get politics done unless you work with people that you disagree with on a variety of issues. And so those kinds of fusionist projects are not only possible, but necessary. On the theoretical point, yeah, I mean, I think, there's a tendency, it's probably a tendency to which I myself am suspect of kind of overcorrecting, right? Of maybe sort of rejecting, I've, like you, have been very much involved in the kind of left fusionist project of trying to reconcile libertarian commitments with left-leaning commitments of social justice. And there's a easy tendency there to reject real insights on the other side of the political spectrum, which I'm trying hard not to do, right? I'm trying to move a little bit back in that direction now, so my pendulum is swinging to and fro. But yeah, I mean, I'm of the view that any political ideology that has survived for a couple of 100 years probably has some good points underlying it that explain its existence. So you ignore those points at your peril, whether it's left, right, or center.
Stephanie, anything on that?
Nope, I'll leave it there.
In that case, we will come to Akiva.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we hear you.
Okay, great. So I'm wondering, and I was thinking about this over the course of the talk, to what extent the divide between libertarians and conservatism rests on a understanding of whether virtue should be enforced, or whether it really rests on a divide between what virtue is. So if I think about, the things that conservatives often consider vices, prostitution, pornography, homosexuality, drug use, much of my divide comes from the fact that I don't think any of those things are vices, and so I'm not willing to enforce them. I might not be willing to enforce them even if they were. But then if I think about things that I do think are vices, so theft, murder, violence against persons, causing harm in that way, in that kind of way. Those are vices that I would be willing to enforce and use government coercion to stop. And so, to some extent, to me, it seems like the debate is about the definition of vices, or the definition of virtue, conversely, rather than the debate about enforcement.
I can start on that one. I don't see it that way. I mean, I think there's plenty. I'm a libertarian. I'm a practicing Catholic, pro-life, libertarian at Reason Magazine. So I think there's plenty of space within the big tent of libertarianism for disagreement about what counts as a vice. And just because I think that something is, let's say, immoral or sinful, even use that word, doesn't mean that I think it should be banned, prohibited by law, or coercion should be used to stop people, to protect people from themselves. And vice versa. Just because I think something is good doesn't mean I'm willing to use the state to try to coerce people or even nudge. I'm uncomfortable even with attempts to nudge people into making better choices, although that becomes more complicated in those cases. And I think I use this example all the time, but I'll just say it because I think it really is a helpful illustration. I think intuitively most people do agree that there's a distinction between these things. Most people, even the most libertarian, most people would agree that there are some things that are immoral that shouldn't be illegal, such as adultery, right? Almost everybody agrees that cheating on your spouse is immoral. Hardly anybody wants to empower, armed agents of the state to enforce that law, to be, raiding people's bedrooms and hauling away philanderers and locking them up. So there is clearly a distinction here that we recognize in at least one case, and I think there are a bunch of cases. And so as a libertarian, what I say is we ought to scrutinize every proposed use of government force in that same way and have a really high bar before we will allow the state to become involved. Just because it's a vice doesn't mean, and that's part of what makes you a libertarian. I think that's what makes libertarians, the way that we're hardwired, to the extent that we're hardwired a certain way. I think it is that we're skeptical of passing laws, of using legal coercion, just because we think something is good or bad.
Yeah, I agree with Stephanie. I think it's both debates, right? There are debates about what virtues are and what vices are, and there's debates about whether the things you think are virtues ought to be enforced or not.
Right, thanks. Coming now to Barry.
Thanks, Matt and Stephanie. Been really enjoying the discussion here. It seems to me that one way to really pull out the need, perhaps, for libertarians and conservatives, perhaps, to be talking more closely together, is in how they're in opposition to that wave of popularism that is seemingly to be sweeping the world at the moment. In Britain, we've had sort of Brexit and Johnson. Across Europe, you've got Orban and sort of the Polish leadership who are espousing a sort of a anti sort of liberal democratic value structure. And of course, in America, you've got Trump, and elsewhere around the world. So it would seem to be a really interesting way, perhaps, to sort of look at those common elements that both of you have really pulled out, both in libertarianism and conservatism, and actually say there's actually a lot more that of commonality here, not least of which is an agreement on the sort of almost the terms of the political debate, of which populism goes way beyond the norms and actually undermines those basic tenets that libertarians and conservatives typically hold to. And you can see sort of tendrils of populism entering both the conservative space and the libertarian space, threatening both, and the combined projects of both.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's 100% right. Let me just say, but gosh, what a delight this is to see all these old friends here who I haven't seen for such a long time. Hey, Barry. Yeah, no, that's 100% right. I think whether you're a classical liberal or a kind of more traditionalist conservative, right, one who believes in evolved institutions, right, you've got equally good and sometimes quite overlapping reasons to reject this wave of populism. I think here of George Will, right, who is a very, very thoughtful conservative / classical liberal, who's really articulated this particular position more clearly than just about anybody else I can think of. So it's definitely a possibility and an important one to see more of, I hope.
Yeah, one of the mental maps that I use a lot is, and in the American context especially, we always are primed to think in terms of left versus right as a spectrum. But adding that second dimension of, and I usually say liberal versus illiberal, you can name it how you want. But I kind of don't like actually populism as a word, because populism doesn't necessarily require you to be illiberal or authoritarian. It maybe is correlated with it, but anyway, clearly there is this divide that divides both the left and the right, from the liberal left from the illiberal left, and the liberal right from the illiberal right. And a lot of what's going on the illiberal right is what I'm focusing on in my work right now. I'm covering them and I on what's going on there and trying to figure out how to counter that, because I do see it as, a threat to rule of law, right? To basic, as you're describing, sort of liberal democratic norms and values and institutions. And it's very hard to imagine any kind of bridge building between people, excuse me, who accept liberal norms and those who reject them, especially in the more egregious ways that you see from some of the more extreme people on the illiberal right. And I'm sure the same thing is true on the left, liberal left and illiberal left, but I'm focusing, I guess I sort of feel like I used to always think about, early in my career, I thought about myself as defending, liberty against threats from the left mostly, and now I'm just very worried about what's happening sort of in my own backyard on the illiberal right.
Great, thanks. Come now to my colleague Sabine.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation. This is a conversation I have with my colleagues and friends too, so it's nice to hear from two people talking about it this way. I was stuck on something that Stephanie said, maybe in passing, but I thought it was very interesting. Libertarians as a tempering force for conservatives, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Stephanie, so if you didn't say that or you said it in a different way, please correct me. But I thought that was very interesting, and going off of that, I'm wondering if you both think that they should be willing to be like a resource for both the modern left and the right. Like, is that what libertarians are really useful for right now? Like being that tempering force? And how much should libertarians take on the role of that tempering force rather than taking on sort of a more activist or educational role? I think that's just something interesting to me personally. So I'd love to hear from you both on that.
I actually don't think that I said that or meant to say that. That's a really interesting thought. And it reminds me of a thing that I occasionally will make this joke that what is going on in our politics? That suddenly the libertarian who wants to put heroin in vending machines and seen as the moderate in our politics more often than not these days, right? I'm the one saying, can't we all just get along? And it is a very strange moment right now politically, because the sort of illiberal left and the illiberal right, the elements of the left and the right that are more illiberal, that are more authoritarian, are sort of dominating the conversation more and more. It creates the horseshoe where it's like they're up here and suddenly I'm in the middle somehow, even though I'm a libertarian who was, historically considered to be the radical. So in a sense, I guess there's something there that I just want to restore basic liberal harmony. I just want to get back to that point where we agree that peaceful coexistence is a worthy goal, as opposed to thinking that the only option in politics is to treat it as a total war in which I destroy my enemies or I am destroyed by my enemies. We're moving away from the liberals settlement, this idea of mutual. I talk about mutual forbearance. I will forego the use of force against you, and you will forego the use of force against me, so that we can live in peace together, because war is worse. I feel like on the left and the right, that's out of fashion right now. And so I guess I am in some ways trying to temper both sides, and call them back to the liberal foundations.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic with the thing that Stephanie didn't say, I guess, right? That I think I'm a pluralist, politically and ethically. I think that the theories that we construct to explain the political or the moral realm are necessarily incomplete and imperfect. So every theory that we've constructed, whether it's libertarianism or conservatism, utilitarianism or Kantianism, is subject to counterexamples and problems of various kinds. But despite that fact, all of those theories, I think, can provide a useful framework through which to see the world in various situations, right? So I'm not a strict libertarian myself, but I think that in certain contexts, strict libertarianism provides us with a kind of lens that allows us to see injustices in a way that we might not see if we were looking through a different lens, right? If we were wearing our Burkean glasses, right? Our Oakshottian glasses. I think, the injustice of slavery, right? The struggle for women's emancipation in the late 19th century. I think libertarianism gave those issues a kind of clarity in a way that was sometimes lacking from other perspectives. So that doesn't mean it's the whole truth. My old mentor, my dissertation director, David Schmitz, liked to talk about moral theories as maps. He says, look, we never expect that you're going to have one map that's suitable for all purposes, right? Like, if you've got a map, a city map, like back in the older days where you used to unfold these things, right, in your car to drive from point A to point B, like that's great if you want to know how to get from your house to the grocery store. Not so great if you want to get from your house to the nation's capital, right? You need a different map from that. And that other map is going to highlight different aspects of reality, and it's going to distort or obscure different aspects of morality. That isn't a problem with the map. That's a problem with using the map for a purpose to which it's not suited. So I think the same thing can be said of political theories like libertarianism. So it can be a useful corrective, a useful framework, even if it's not an all-purpose one.
But we've solved this problem now, Matt. We have all the maps we need on the phone. So all we need is the app with all the correct ethical theories in there, and we'll be able to find our way. We are coming into the home stretch. We've got one more hand on the queue. Then I'm going to come to a couple questions in the chat. Alex McCall, take it away.
Hi, can you hear me now? Perfect. I enjoyed a lot of what was said. One thing that I didn't really see from the other questions was talking about electoral incentives. And Janet Buffton actually made me a very bad partisan when she asked me, when was the last time mainstream conservatives in Canada compromised to advance the libertarian position? And we've definitely seen under First Past the Post in Canada, the illiberal right win the safe seats all the time, which means they get to spend millions of taxpayer dollars giving other illiberal right people staffer jobs in the government, whether they be. And when they're in opposition, they love the libertarians. But when they're in government, they do things like vote to keep same-sex marriage illegal. They criminalized sex work in Canada. There's very little advancement. And then I look to New Zealand with mixed member proportional, where they have ACT, or Ireland, where they have single transferable vote. And they have, I'm going to screw up the pronunciation, but something Gale Fane or something like that. So my question is, under First Past the Post, where does libertarianism fit in, or do we need to advance proportional representation to advance libertarian ideas?
Got any thoughts on that, Matt?
Not super well developed thoughts. I think if you look back at sort of the last century or so of American politics, and you ask okay, where did libertarians get any wins, and if so, how did those wins come about? I think the answer to the first question is yes. The United States politics has moved quite strongly in the direction of liberty, right? Of the value that libertarians care about. Whether you're talking about something like airline deregulation, right, or the abolition of the military draft, or whether you're talking about, in some ways, broader cultural changes and acceptance of, right, different sexual lifestyles, or again, racial integration. But it wasn't libertarians who were sort of directly politically responsible for those moves, right? Libertarians may have been responsible in developing the ideas that were later picked up by somebody else to make those political changes happen. And so maybe that's an important, maybe the important role for libertarians, right? Milton Friedman, in his Introduction to Capitalism and Freedom, wrote that, right, the purpose of writing books like that is to have the ideas out there in the ecosystem so that when a crisis comes, when the status quo is no longer sustainable, there's an alternative out there already thought out and developed for somebody else to come and pick up. And I think that that's usually going to be how progress is made in a democratic society, whether it's in a first past the post system or system of proportional representation. It's that libertarian ideas are going to be adopted by other people with power, and that's how they're going to get implemented. You're not going to get, Ron Paul is not going to get elected, and even if he was elected as president of the United States, right, it wouldn't be the case that he could simply implement whatever rules he wanted to implement. So usually it's going to be a more indirect circuitous route, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think there's any doubt that the structure of the system does influence the policy outcomes you get, the types of people who get elected. The fact that in the US, for example, the Libertarian Party has never gotten anywhere is true for many reasons. And some of those are squarely on the, to the responsibility of the Libertarian Party and the candidates they run and the way they run their campaigns and all. But some of it too is when you don't have proportional representation, third parties always have a very hard time. It's almost impossible to get anywhere. And so one way to look at that is if you wanted to, should we be focusing our effort on making structural reform, change the Constitution, get rid of first past the post, implement something more like proportional or whatever. Maybe that would make things easier, but I think it's really hard to actually guess what the repercussions of that would be. And I don't know that I would be happier if the current Libertarian Party in the US were, having more electoral success. So to me, I think I tend to agree, and probably that's why I do what I do for a living, and probably why Matt does what he does for a living, which is that I think having good ideas in the bloodstream and in the conversation is probably the best use of my time. That's the bet I've made, right? As opposed to becoming an activist for why we need a constitutional amendment to get rid of the electoral college or do this or do that. That's the bet I've made. I tend to be a believer that you have to change hearts and minds, change culture, change public opinion, that policy, follows. It's not a perfectly clean correlation, with directional arrows running in only causal arrows only running in one direction. I know, but my bet is that you're going to make more of a difference by trying to lay the intellectual groundwork and put the ideas out there and make the arguments and persuade people than by hoping that you can somehow through tinkering design the right system that will lead to the outcomes that will actually be better. Maybe somebody is smart enough to know how to do that. I definitely don't feel like I am.
Yeah, thanks. Going to come quickly to a couple questions in the chat, try to get to these fairly quickly, and then move on to final thoughts from both of you. Guido Calderini, actually a former intern with us here at the ILS. Hey, Guido, asks, should our position on fusionism be dynamic and change with the ratio of virtue and freedom in a society?
Yes.
That's not okay. Go for it. Do you want to say more?
No. Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, right. It sort of goes back to my point about lenses, right? I mean, I think, if you believe in a plurality of values, if you believe that both freedom and virtue are important, then where you put your emphasis at any point in time is and ought to be a function of context, right? What needs emphasis right now? What needs the stress? Where are the weak points? Like Stephanie was saying, right? Back in the olden days, I think if you were concerned with human liberty, then where you wanted to put your bullets was in the left, right? Because that was where the threat was coming from. Now things have changed. So, where we ought to be putting our energies, the kind of ideas we ought to be articulating, is largely a product of, what are the threats? What does the world look like today? And that's something that can change very fast.
I think the only sense in which I disagree is that one of the things I'm trying to avoid by trying to revive fusionism, correctly understood, is that if you don't have any rules that say things like, liberty is the highest political value, not virtue, then everything is always just a constant tug of war between different camps. Who can get the upper hand at this moment? And whoever has political power or the majority or makes the stronger arguments or gets lucky on election day or whatever is constantly, and you hear this in the rhetoric sometimes. Conservatives will say, well, you know, you libertarians have just exerted more influence, undue influence over the last few decades, and it's time for a rebalancing. We conservatives need to have more say over public policy that the Republican Party pursues. And I'm going, I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think the right way to look at it is that we should all agree that we should be pursuing policies that defend individual rights and liberties in the governmental sphere, and then we should go into the other sphere to pursue. If you feel like the culture isn't what it should be, we should be figuring out how to attack that problem in the other sphere. That's a really useful, at least heuristic for figuring out how to start solving problems, as opposed to constantly thinking that everything is constantly up for debate. At any moment, we could always be trying to be on every single issue. We have to decide afresh whether to, you know, put liberty or virtue first. That to me seems like you lose a lot of the value of the fusionist way of thinking if you approach it that way.
Our last question comes from my wife, Janet, who is, in addition to Matt's excellent book, The Individualists, recently been reading Helena Rosenblatt's History of Liberalism, and says that Rosenblatt talks about certain virtues, civic virtues, public-mindedness, generosity, education, civility, that Rosenblatt says are embedded with sort of the liberal project or the liberal tradition. And she's curious if you think that the conservative conceptions of virtue are, for some reason, do they or why do they align better with what a libertarian might want? I hope I phrased that correctly.
Can you give me that list of things that she said associated with liberalism?
Of public-mindedness, generosity, education, civility.
I think all of that is consistent with conservatism, right? And liberalism. So the hard questions are where the rubber meets the road, and what do you mean, you know, how do you instantiate these things in the real world? But I don't think that there's anything in the theory that makes them incompatible with each other.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, great. In that case, we'll move on to our closing statements. We started with Stephanie, and I know sometimes people start and end, or they reverse it, but that seems to give the same person the first and the last word. So I'm going to invite Stephanie to start off with her closing thoughts, and then we will give Matt Zed the last word.
I will be very, very short. The one thing that I didn't respond to, something where maybe Matt and I disagree somewhat, and I didn't get around to sort of pointing to it earlier, was you were talking about how if we focus on maximizing liberty, then we may end up with something less than maximum virtue as the result, right? It's not clear to me that that's right. I'm open to the possibility that may be the way it plays out. But to me, it seems that, you know, Lord Acton's famous maxim that power has a tendency to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think the lesson here is that when we give anybody, any actor, any institution, any entity, the right to coerce other people in society, we're running the risk of corrupting them, right? Of making them, in fact, worse people or less virtuous, because the temptation to use power, to abuse that power in some way, is so strong. And I think a lot about the ways in which public policy that we implement with the best of intentions, welfare policy, for example, we want to have a social safety net that helps the least among us in our society, those who really are in need. And so we implement a government program to do that. The ways in which accidentally that can breed less virtue in the recipients, right? Dependence, less eroded sense of personal agency in the people who are receiving that aid. Maybe sometimes it traps them into making worse choices, like there's a marriage penalty baked into the policies or something like that. But also the ways in which it makes all of us who are not receiving the aid, but whose tax dollars are funding those programs, feel like, well, we've done our duty. I don't have a responsibility to my neighbor in need anymore, because the government's job is to help those people, and I pay my taxes, right? And there's a whole bureaucracy staffed with people whose job it is to help those in need. So I can walk past the person on the street, or I can ignore the state of the schools in my neighborhood, or whatever the social problem closest to us. We don't think of ourselves as being on the front lines of solving problems because government is there and those government programs exist. And so there's unintended which is a long way of saying unintended consequences of government programs or of government, or of anything less than putting, you know, freedom as the highest political value. Sometimes unintended consequences can be to actually make us less virtuous as individuals or as a society. I think that can happen.
Thanks, Stephanie. Over to you, Matt.
Oh, well, I'm glad Stephanie challenged me on that, because I was thinking I kind of already said what I had to say, but now I have something new to talk about. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm a libertarian of sorts, but one of the things that I think libertarians do badly sometimes is to move from sound generalizations to absolute rules as a conclusion. And I think right there, this happens in a lot of cases, right, where libertarians will talk about kind of public choice problems with government, right? The tendency of government agencies to be captured by special interests and manipulated to promote the interests of a few as opposed to the common good. I think that's a thing that happens. The production of unintended consequences, that's also a thing that happens. Does either of those things mean that the benefits of government actions, however you choose to quantify benefits, whether it's in terms of producing utility or fostering economic growth or fostering virtue, do any of those things show that the benefits of government actions will not outweigh the costs in any circumstance? No. And here again, and gosh, I never thought I would cite Brent Bozell approvingly so many times in the course of a talk. But I think Bozell just got this right in his response to Meyer. I actually brought it up because he on my screen here, because he says it maybe better than I can, right? So it's talking about this passage from Acton about power corrupting. Bozell comments that Acton rightly did not try to convert this essentially prudential judgment about the dangers of government action into an absolute rule for restricting government power. He did not, that is to say, and neither should we, commit the elementary logical fallacy of turning the proposition, quote, the state that governs most will govern worst, into the proposition, quote, the state that governs least will govern best. If the judgment is a prudential, I'm still quoting Bozell here, if the judgment is a prudential one, the question in every case will be, will this grant of power in this instance for this object produce a net good for the individual members of the Commonwealth? And I think that if what you're concerned to do is to maximally promote the virtue and flourishing of your citizens, the idea that liberty is always going to be the most effective means for doing that is misguided. And so you're going to have to choose. You're going to have to choose liberty or virtue. And as a libertarian, my inclination is to come down on the side of liberty all the time. I think Stephanie's inclination is the same, though I think I'm doing so with the awareness that I'm making a sacrifice there. It's not a costless choice. You know, it's a tragic world that we live in, a world where we cannot simultaneously realize all values at all times. And sometimes we have to give up some good things for the sake of other better things.
Wonderful. With that, we are right on time to wrap up. I want to thank Matt and Stephanie for joining us for a great conversation. I think that your comments were insightful and helpful, and really pursued our aim of having a conversation. We're not going to poll the audience and find out who won or anything like that. I think we all won, because we're going to leave with a greater understanding of the subject matter. And that might be the cheesiest closing I've had to one of these sessions. But I really want to thank you. I know you're both busy people. Love that you took your time out of your days for this. Thanks to everyone who attended. I know you're like us. You probably have lots of Zoom meetings and things to do. So we really love that you felt this was worth your time to come and join us. I think it was great. The questions were wonderful. Next week, I will be away doing some events. My colleague Sabine will be here with Peter Jaworski talking about paying for bone marrow donations. I hope you'll consider attending that one. I think it'll be a great event, even though I will not be able to attend it personally. Thanks again, everyone. Hope to see some more of these regularly. And again, thanks very much to you, Matt and Stephanie, for helping make this such a great event. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
You.